I never should have come on this stupid camping trip. That's what I kept telling myself as I huddled in the damp darkness, straining my ears for any sound that might give away the presence of what? I didn't even know anymore. All I knew was that something was out there in the endless sea of pines, something that had already taken Eric's dad. And now it was hunting us. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should start at the beginning, back when this was just supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my friends. God, was that really only 2 days ago? It feels like a lifetime. My name's Charlie, and I'm in 8th grade at Millbrook Middle School. Just your average 13-year-old kid, I guess. Not particularly athletic or popular, but I've got a solid group of friends. That's who I was with when everything went to hell. Eric, Peter, Jason, and Robert. Eric had been going on and on about this camping trip for weeks. His dad, Mr. Larson, was some kind of outdoorsman and had promised to take Eric and a few friends deep into the Adirondacks for a real wilderness experience. No cell phones, no iPads, just good old-fashioned camping. Eric was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement. "Come on, Charlie, it'll be awesome," he'd said, grinning from ear to ear. "My dad's gonna teach us how to track animals, build shelters, all that survival stuff." I'd been hesitant at first. The thought of being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by who knows what, didn't exactly fill me with enthusiasm. But peer pressure is a hell of a thing, and eventually, I caved. So there we were, piled into Mr. Larson's massive SUV early on a crisp Friday morning in October. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the world in a riot of reds and golds. It should have been beautiful. Instead, as we drove deeper and deeper into the wilderness, leaving civilization far behind, I felt a growing sense of unease settling in the pit of my stomach. I glanced around at my friends, wondering if any of them felt the same. Eric, of course, was practically vibrating with excitement, his mop of blonde hair bouncing as he pointed out landmarks to his dad. He'd always been the adventurous one of our group, always pushing us to try new things, take risks. Sometimes it led to amazing experiences. Other times, well, let's just say Eric's ideas didn't always pan out. Next to Eric sat Peter, his nose buried in a thick paperback. Classic Peter. While the rest of us were busy with sports or video games, Peter devoured books like they were going out of style. He pushed his glasses up his nose and flipped another page, completely oblivious to the world around him. In the back row with me were Jason and Robert. Jason was sound asleep, his bulky frame taking up more than his fair share of the seat. The gentle giant of our group, Jason was the kind of guy who could bench press a small cart but wouldn't hurt a fly. His snores filled the car, providing an oddly comforting background noise. Robert, on the other hand, was wide awake, his dark eyes darting nervously from window to window. Out of all of us, Robert was the one I was most surprised to see on this trip. He wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type. More of a computer geek, really. Always talking about coding and AI and stuff I barely understood. But here he was, clutching his backpack like a lifeline. "You okay, Rob?" I whispered, not wanting to wake Jason or interrupt Mr. Larson's running commentary on the local flora and fauna. Robert jumped slightly, then gave me a weak smile. "Yeah, just not used to all this nature, you know? It's so big." I nodded, understanding completely. The farther we drove, the smaller I felt, like we were being swallowed up by the vast, indifferent wilderness. After what felt like hours, Mr. Larson finally pulled off onto a barely visible dirt road. We bounced and jolted along for another 20 minutes before he brought the car to a stop in a small clearing. "All right, boys, he boomed, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "This is where our real adventure begins. Grab your packs, we've got about a 5-mile hike to our campsite." 5 miles? Through this dense forest? I exchanged a worried glance with Robert, but there was no backing out now. We piled out of the car, shouldering our heavy backpacks. Mr. Larson led the way, machete in hand to clear any obstacles, with Eric right on his heels. The rest of us fell into line behind them, with me bringing up the rear. As we hiked, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, damper. Strange bird calls echoed in the distance, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. But it wasn't until we were about halfway to the campsite that I first noticed something was off. It was subtle at first, just a feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows between the trees. But there was never anything there. Just more trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. Then I started to notice the silence. It fell suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch. One moment, the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. The next, nothing. Just the crunch of our boots on the leaf-strewn ground and our labored breathing. I wasn't the only one who noticed. I saw Robert's head swiveling back and forth, his eyes wide with fear. Even Jason, usually so laid back, seemed on edge. "Hey, Mr. Larson?" Peter called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Is it, normal for the forest to get this quiet?" Mr. Larson paused, frowning slightly. "Well, sometimes animals will go quiet if there's a predator in the area. Bear, maybe, or a mountain lion. Nothing to worry about, boys. They're more afraid of us than we are of them." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they had the opposite effect on me. A bear? A mountain lion? How was that supposed to make us feel better? We pressed on, the silence growing heavier with each step. And then, just as the last of the daylight was fading, we heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold and my heart leap into my throat. It was a scream. High-pitched, agonized, and very, very human. Mr. Larson froze, his hand flying up in a gesture for us to stop. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, more to himself than to us. "Dad?" Eric's voice was small, scared. I'd never heard him sound like that before. "Dad, what do we do?" For a long moment, Mr. Larson didn't move. Then he seemed to shake himself, turning to face us with a forced smile. "It's probably nothing, boys. Maybe some animal that sounds like a person. But just to be safe, we're going to set up camp right here for the night. Okay?" We nodded mutely, too scared to argue. As we started to unpack our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake. We should have turned back, should have run as fast as we could back to the car and civilization. But we didn't. And as the night closed in around us, bringing with it a chorus of unnatural sounds and fleeting shadows just beyond the reach of our flashlights, I realized with growing horror that it might already be too late. We set up camp in a small clearing, our tents forming a tight circle around the fire pit Mr. Larson insisted on building. "Fire keeps the animals away," he said, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made that scream wasn't afraid of a little campfire. As the flames flickered to life, casting wan shadows across our faces, I studied my friends. Eric was trying to put on a brave face, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Peter had his nose in his book again, but he wasn't turning any pages. Jason sat on a log, his massive frame hunched over, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. And Robert. Robert was muttering to himself, fingers flying over the screen of a small device he pulled from his pocket. "Hey!" Mr. Larson's sharp voice made us all jump. "I thought I said no electronics, Robert. Hand it over." Robert clutched the device to his chest, his eyes wide. "But Mr. Larson, I dash." "No buts. This is about experiencing nature, remember? Now give it here." Reluctantly, Robert surrendered the gadget. Mr. Larson pocketed it with a satisfied nod. "All right, boys. Who wants to learn how to roast the perfect marshmallow?" But none of us were in the mood for campfire treats. The forest around us seemed alive with whispers and movement just beyond the reach of the firelight. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh jolt of fear through me. "Mr. Larson," I finally worked up the courage to ask, what if that scream wasn't an animal? Shouldn't we try to help? He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Look, Charlie, I know you're scared. All of you are. But trust me, there's nothing out there that we need to worry about. Probably just a fox or something. Now, let's try to get some sleep, okay? Things will look better in the morning." But sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake in my tent, shared with Robert, listening to the sounds of the forest. Robert's whispers broke the silence. "Charlie? You awake?" I rolled over to face him. "Yeah. Can't sleep either?" He shook his head, his face pale in the dim light of the moon filtering through the tent fabric. "There's something wrong here, Charlie. Really wrong. I've been tracking it." "Tracking what?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. "The anomalies. The electromagnetic disturbances. They're off the charts out here. That's what my device was for, before Mr. Larson took it. Charlie, I don't think we're dealing with animals. I think there's something else out here. Something not natural." I wanted to laugh it off, to tell Robert he was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew he was right. There was something fundamentally wrong about these woods, something that set every nerve on edge. A sudden scream pierced the night, much closer this time. We bolted upright, our eyes wide with terror. It was followed by the sound of running feet, branches snapping, and then silence. "Boys? Everything okay in there?" Mr. Larson's voice came from outside, tense and alert. Before we could answer, another scream split the air. This time, I recognized the voice. It was Eric. What happened next was a blur of confusion and terror. We burst out of our tents to find Eric's empty, a trail of disturbed undergrowth leading into the dark forest. Mr. Larson was already charging down the path, flashlight in one hand, hunting knife in the other. "Eric! Eric, answer me!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. We followed, stumbling through the darkness, branches whipping in our faces. The beam of Mr. Larson's flashlight danced crazily ahead of us, illuminating snippets of the forest, a gnarled root here, a flash of leaves there. And then, suddenly, the light fell on Eric. He was standing in a small clearing, his back to us, completely motionless. "Eric!" "Thank God," Mr. Larson breathed, rushing forward. "Are you okay? What happened?" Eric didn't respond. Didn't move. As we got closer, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was very, very wrong. Eric? I called out, my voice shaking. Eric, come on, man. You're scaring us. Slowly, so slowly, Eric began to turn. And as his face came into view, illuminated by the harsh beam of the flashlight, I heard someone, maybe me, maybe all of us, let out a terrified scream. It wasn't Eric. Not anymore. The thing that faced us wore Eric's clothes, had Eric's blonde hair. But the face was wrong. Distorted. The eyes were too large, the mouth a gaping maw filled with needle-sharp teeth. And the skin, it seemed to ripple and shift, as if something was moving beneath it. Run, Mr. Larson whispered, his voice choked with horror. Run. We turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush, blind with terror. Behind us, I could hear something pursuing. Not footsteps, but a wet, slithering sound that seemed to come from all around us. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning in that nightmarish flight through the dark forest. All I knew was the burning in my lungs, the sting of branches against my skin, and the overwhelming need to get away. Finally, gasping for air, we burst into another clearing. This one was different. In the center stood a massive, ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching towards the star-filled sky like grasping fingers. At its base was a dark opening, a cave or a hollow in the trunk, I couldn't tell. In there, Mr. Larson panted, gesturing towards the opening. Quick, before it catches up. We didn't hesitate. One by one, we squeezed through the narrow opening, finding ourselves in a spacious hollow within the tree. It was pitch black inside, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Is everyone here? Mr. Larson whispered, his voice tight with fear. Sound off. Here, I gasped. Present, came Peter's shaky voice. Why yeah, stammered Robert. A grunt from Jason confirmed his presence. 5 of us. We lost Eric, but the rest of us had made it. For now. Outside, we could hear something moving. Circling. Waiting. Mr. Larson, Robert whispered, his voice barely audible. What was that thing? In the darkness, I heard Mr. Larson take a deep, shuddering breath. I don't know, son. I've never seen anything like it. But I swear, I'm going to get you boys out of here. Somehow. As we huddled together in the hollow of that ancient tree, surrounded by the sounds of something inhuman prowling just outside, I realized that our ordeal was far from over. Whatever that thing was, whatever had taken Eric, it wasn't going to give up easily. And as the long night wore on, I began to wonder, was it just Eric it had taken? Or was it possible that none of us were who we thought we were anymore? The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I pressed myself further into the damp earth of our hiding place, straining my ears for any sound that might give away the creature's location. But all I could hear was the ragged breathing of my friends and the wild pounding of my own heart. What had started as a simple camping trip had become a nightmare beyond imagination. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrible thought began to form. What if we never made it out of these woods? As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in our wooden sanctuary, I realized that our fight for survival was only just beginning. The pale light of dawn brought little comfort. We'd spent the night huddled in that hollowed-out tree, jumping at every sound, every whisper of wind through the leaves. None of us had slept. How could we, after what we'd seen? All right, boys, Mr. Larson whispered, his voice hoarse. We need to make a plan. We can't stay here forever. But what about that thing? Peter asked, pushing his glasses up his nose with a trembling hand. It's still out there, isn't it? Mr. Larson's silence was answer enough. I could see the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, aging him years in a single night. He was supposed to protect us, to keep us safe. But how could anyone be prepared for something like this? We need to get back to the car, he finally said. It's our only chance of getting out of here and finding help for Eric. His voice caught on his son's name, and I saw a flash of raw pain cross his face before he composed himself. But we don't even know where we are, Jason pointed out, his usual confidence replaced by fear. We ran for who knows how long last night. We could be miles from our campsite. I might be able to help with that, Robert said hesitantly. We all turned to look at him. Remember the device Mr. Larson confiscated? It wasn't just for tracking anomalies. It also has GPS. Mr. Larson's eyes widened. He quickly dug into his pocket, pulling out Robert's device. Can you use this to get us back to the car? Robert nodded, taking the device with reverent terror. I think so. It'll take me a few minutes to boot it up and get a signal, but dash. A blood-curdling shriek cut through the morning air, so close it seemed to vibrate through the very wood around us. We froze, hardly daring to breathe. It's found us, I whispered, terror clawing in my throat. Mr. Larson's face set in grim determination. Okay, change of plans. Robert, you work on getting that GPS going. The rest of us are going to make a run for it. We'll try to draw it away, give Robert some time. Once you've got our location, try to make your way back to the car. If we're not there, just go. Get help. But Mr. Larson I started to protest. No arguments, Charlie. It's our best chance. He turned to Robert. You think you can do this, son? Robert gulped but nodded, his fingers already dancing over the device's screen. Good man. All right, boys. On my mark, we run. Robert, you stay here until it's clear, understood? We nodded, our hearts pounding in our chests. Mr. Larson peered out of the hollow, then held up 3 fingers. 2. 1. Now! We burst out of the tree, sprinting in the opposite direction from where we heard the cry. I could hear it behind us almost immediately, that wet, slithering sound that haunted my nightmares. But we didn't look back. We couldn't. We ran until our lungs burned, weaving between trees, leaping over fallen logs. Mr. Larson led the way, his longer strides keeping him just ahead of us. And then, without warning, he wasn't. One moment he was there, crashing through the underbrush. But next, he was gone, as if the forest had swallowed him whole. Mr. Larson! Peter cried out, skidding to a halt. We stopped, spinning around wildly, searching for any sign of him. There was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the eerie stillness of the forest. We have to go back, Jason said, his voice shaking. We can't just leave him. But even as he spoke, we heard it, that terrible, inhuman shriek, coming from the direction Mr. Larson had vanished. It was answered by another cry, this one undoubtedly human. A scream of pure agony that cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than any sound. Oh God, Peter whimpered. Oh God, oh God, oh God. I felt like I was going to be sick. Mr. Larson was gone. Just like Eric. Taken by whatever ungodly thing lurked in these woods. And we were alone. We need to get back to Robert, I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears. We need to get out of here. The others nodded mutely, too shocked and scared to argue. We turned and began to make our way back the way we'd come, moving as quietly as we could. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through our systems. When we finally reached the hollow tree, we found Robert waiting for us, his face pale with fear. I heard the screams, he whispered. Mr. Larson. I shook my head, unable to form the words. Robert's face crumpled, but he took a deep breath and held up his device. I've got our location, he said. The car's about 3 miles northeast of here. But guys, there's something else you need to see. He turned the screen towards us. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at, a mess of lines and colors, like some abstract painting. But then I realized what it was, a topographical map of the area. And there, right where we were standing, was a swirling vortex of energy readings, pulsing like a malevolent heart. What is that? Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert's eyes were wide with a mix of fear and fascination. I don't know. But whatever it is, it's not natural. And I think it might be what's behind everything that's happening here. As we stared at the pulsing anomaly on the screen, a chilling realization swept over me. We weren't just lost in the woods. We were trapped in the heart of something ancient and evil, something that had already taken 2 of our number. And as another inhuman howl echoed through the forest, closer this time, I knew with terrifying certainty that it wouldn't stop until it had all of us. We need to move, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. Now. As we gathered what little supplies we had and prepared to make our desperate bid for escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. Some piece of the puzzle that would explain why we were here, why this was happening to us. But there was no time to dwell on it. We had to run, had to fight, had to survive. Because if we didn't make it out of these woods, no one would ever know the horror that lurked within them. And so, with heavy hearts and terror nipping at our heels, we set out into the forest once more, praying that we would live to see another dawn. We moved through the forest like ghosts, our feet barely making a sound on the leaf-strewn ground. Robert led the way, his eyes glued to the device in his hands, guiding us towards what we hoped was salvation. But with each step, the feeling of rawness grew stronger, a palpable miasma that seemed to cling to our skin. Wait, Peter suddenly whispered, grabbing my arm. Do you hear that? We all froze, straining our ears. At first, I heard nothing but the usual forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird. But then, underneath it all, I caught it. A low, pulsing hum, just on the edge of hearing. It's getting stronger, Robert muttered, tapping at his device. The energy readings are off the charts. We're getting close to something. The car? Jason asked hopefully. Robert shook his head. No, this is different. I've never seen readings like this before. As if in response to his words, the forest around us began to change. The trees seemed to twist, their bark rippling like water. The ground beneath our feet softened, becoming spongy and unstable. And the air filled with whispers, countless voices speaking in languages I'd never heard before. Guys, I said, my voice shaking, I think we should turn back. But even as the words left my mouth, I realized it was too late. The forest behind us had changed, becoming an impenetrable wall of writhing vegetation. We had no choice but to press forward. As we stumbled onward, The world around us continued to warp and shift. Colors bled into one another, creating impossible hues that hurt to look at. The ground rose and fell in nauseating waves. And always, that maddening whisper in the air, growing louder with each step. Finally, we emerged into a clearing unlike anything I'd ever seen. In the center stood a massive structure, a twisted amalgamation of metal and organic matter. It pulsed with an otherworldly light, tendrils of energy arcing out to touch the trees surrounding it. What is that thing? Jason breathed, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Robert was furiously tapping at his device, his face pale. It's not from here. Not from Earth. These readings, they're completely alien. As we stood there, trying to process what we were seeing, a figure emerged from behind the structure. My heart leapt into my throat. It was Eric's dad, Mr. Larson. But something was wrong. He moved with an unnatural fluidity, his joints bending in ways they shouldn't. And his eyes were completely black, reflecting the pulsing light of the alien structure. Mr. Larson? Peter called out hesitantly. Are you okay? Mr. Larson's head snapped towards us, a smile spreading across his face that was too wide, too full of teeth. When he spoke, his voice was layered with others, as if 1,000 beings were speaking through him at once. Okay? Oh, I'm more than okay. I'm perfect. We're perfect. And soon, you will be too. I managed to choke out. Mr. Larson's grin widened impossibly further. Oh yes, we. You see, boys, we've been waiting for you. For so long, we've been trapped here, in this little pocket of reality. But now, thanks to you, we can finally break free. As he spoke, more figures emerged from the shadows. Eric, the park ranger we'd seen at the trailhead. Other hikers we didn't recognize. All moving with that same unnatural grace, all with those terrible black eyes. You are beacons, not Mr. Larson continued. Your fear, your confusion, your very humanity, it all served to weaken the barriers holding us here. And now, we're ready to spread across your world. The truth hit me like a physical blow. We hadn't stumbled upon this horror by accident. We'd been lured here. Chosen. Why us? Robert asked, his scientific curiosity somehow overriding his terror. Why children? Not Mr. Larson laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Children are so wonderfully malleable. So full of potential. The perfect vessels for our kind. And you five, oh, you five are special. You each carry a spark of something unique. Something we need. He pointed at each of us in turn. The adventurer. The scholar. The protector. The visionary. And you, his black eyes locked onto mine, the survivor. Together, you'll be the key to our expansion. Our invasion force. We'll never help you, Jason growled, stepping protectively in front of us. Oh, but you will, not Mr. Larson purred. You don't have a choice. In fact, it's already begun. Haven't you noticed? With dawning horror, I looked down at my hands. My skin was rippling, just like the bark of the trees had been. I could feel something moving beneath it, something trying to get out. No, I whispered. No, this can't be happening. But it was. I could feel my thoughts changing, alien concepts and memories flooding my mind. I looked at my friends and saw the same terror and confusion on their faces. We were changing. We were becoming them. As the alien presence clawed its way into my mind, one last, desperate thought managed to break through. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Somehow, someway, we had to fight this. We had to warn the world. But even as I clung to that final shred of humanity, I felt it slipping away, replaced by something vast and unknowable. And as the clearing filled with inhuman laughter, I realized that our camping trip had been more than just a nightmare. It was the beginning of the end of the world. As the alien presence invaded my mind, I felt myself slipping away. Memories, hopes, fears, all of it was being consumed by this otherworldly intelligence. But deep down, in a place I didn't even know existed, a spark of defiance ignited. No! This is my body. My mind. My life. I don't know where the strength came from, but suddenly I was fighting back. I visualized walls in my mind, barriers against the invading consciousness. It wasn't easy. It felt like trying to hold back an ocean with my bare hands, but slowly, inch by inch, I began to reclaim myself. Charlie? I heard Robert's voice, distant and distorted. Charlie, what's happening to you? I opened my eyes, not realizing I had closed them. The clearing swam into focus. My friends were on their knees, their bodies twisting and changing as the alien presence took hold. But they were looking at me with a mixture of awe and hope. Because I was standing. Unchanged. Human. The thing wearing Mr. Larson's face snarled, its features contorting into something inhuman. Impossible, it hissed. You can't resist us. No one can resist us. But I had. Somehow, someway, I had found the strength to fight back. And in that moment, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. About humanity. You're on, I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. We can resist. We will resist. I reached out to Jason, the closest to me. Come on, big guy. I know you're in there. Fight it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Jason's hand twitched, reaching for mine. I grabbed it, and it was like an electric current passed between us. I could feel Jason's essence, his humanity, surging back to the surface. That's it. I encouraged, reaching for Peter with my other hand. Come on, guys. Remember who you are. One by one, my friends began to shake off the alien influence. It wasn't easy. I could see the strain on their faces, the battle raging inside them, but they were doing it. They were coming back. The not Mr. Larson let out a shriek of rage and frustration. The air around us began to vibrate, the alien structure pulsing with angry red light. You fools, it howled. You have no idea what you're giving up. The power, the knowledge it could all be yours. We don't want it, I said firmly. Not at this price. As my friends regained control of themselves, something strange began to happen. The clearing around us started to shift and warp, like reality itself was coming undone. The alien structure flickered, becoming translucent. No, the creature wearing Mr. Larson's face wailed. No, you're ruining everything. I understood then. Our resistance, our humanity, it was somehow undoing whatever force had brought this thing into our world. We were closing the door it had tried to open. Guys, I said urgently, we need to get out of here. Now. We ran. We ran like we'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush as the world fell apart around us. Trees melted into nothingness, the ground rippled like water, and all the while that unearthly howl followed us, filled with rage and despair. I don't know how long we ran, or how we found our way, but suddenly, miraculously, we burst out of the forest and onto the road where we parked the car. It was still there, untouched, a beacon of normalcy in a world gone mad. "Get in," I yelled, yanking open the driver's door. Thank God Mr. Larson had left the keys in the ignition. We piled in, and I turned the key. For one heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then the engine roared to life, and I floored it, sending us hurtling down the road and away from the nightmare behind us. It wasn't until we put miles between us and those awful woods that we finally let ourselves breathe. Let ourselves think about what had happened. "Charlie," Peter said quietly, you saved us." "How?" I shook my head, still not entirely sure myself. "I don't know. I couldn't let it win. I couldn't let it take us." "But Mr. Larson," Jason said, his voice breaking. "And Eric. They're still." "We'll come back," I said firmly. "We'll get help. Real help. And we'll find a way to save them." I didn't know if it was possible. I didn't know if anything would ever be the same again. But I did know one thing. We had faced the impossible, stared into the abyss of an alien horror, and we had survived. We had held on to our humanity. As the first rays of sunlight began to paint the sky, I felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever came next, whatever battles we might face, we would face them together. And we would never, ever give up. Because that's what it means to be human. To fight. To hope. To survive. And as I drove us towards home, towards safety, I made a silent promise. To Mr. Larson, to Eric, to everyone who had been taken by that thing in the woods. We would find a way to save them. We would find a way to stop this. Even if that meant that it cost me my own well-being. I've always loved the Boy Scouts. The campfires, the badges, the camaraderie. It was my escape from the monotony of small-town life. But that summer, the summer of 1994, everything changed. It was the summer that never really ended, at least not in my mind. My name's Jack, and I was 14 years old when Mr. Coldwell became our new scout leader. Looking back, I should have known something was off from the very beginning. It was late May, and our troop was gathering for the first meeting of the summer at the old community center. The peeling paint and musty smell were as familiar to me as my own bedroom. I took my usual seat between my best friend, Thatcher, and the ever-fidgeting Spork. Yeah, that was his real name. His hippie parents had a lot to answer for. "Where's Mr. Holloway?" Thatcher whispered, his freckled face scrunched up in confusion. Our old leader was nowhere to be seen. Before I could respond, the double doors at the back of the room swung open with a creak that set my teeth on edge. In walked a man I'd never seen before. He was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed just a little too long for his body. His skin was pale, almost translucent, like he'd never seen the sun. But it was his eyes that really got me. They were the palest blue I'd ever seen, so light they almost looked white. "Good evening, boys," he said, his voice surprisingly deep and smooth. "I'm Mr. Coldwell, your new scout leader." A murmur ran through the room. "New leader? What happened to Mr. Holloway?" Mr. Coldwell smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I know this is unexpected, but Mr. Holloway had to, stepped down due to personal reasons. I'm looking forward to getting to know each and every one of you." As he said this, his gaze swept across the room, and for a split second, I could have sworn his eyes lingered on me. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The meeting proceeded as normal, but there was an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Mr. Coldwell was polite, even charming at times, but there was something about him that just felt off. After the meeting, as we were filing out, I overheard Ziggy, our resident conspiracy theorist, whispering to Blink, the quiet kid who always had his nose in a book. "I'm telling you, man, something's not right with that guy," Ziggy hissed. "Did you see how he kept staring at Jack? It's like he was sizing him up or something." Blink just shrugged, but I felt my stomach do a flip. So I wasn't the only one who'd noticed. As the weeks went by, things got progressively weirder. Mr. Coldwell seemed to take a special interest in me, always calling on me to demonstrate knots or lead discussions. At first, I was flattered by the attention, but it soon became uncomfortable. Then there were the strange occurrences. Items would go missing from our packs, only to turn up in odd places. The forest around our usual campsite seemed different somehow, darker, more oppressive. And more than once, I could have sworn I saw Mr. Coldwell standing at the edge of the woods, watching us, when he was supposed to be back at the main camp. It all came to a head during our annual summer camping trip. We were deep in the woods, further than we'd ever gone before. Mr. Coldwell said he knew a special spot, a hidden lake that would be perfect for a week-long excursion. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. More than once, I thought I heard whispers on the wind, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. We reached the lake just as the sun was setting. It was beautiful, I'll give it that, crystal clear water reflecting the orange and pink sky. But there was something else, too. A heaviness in the air, a sense of anticipation, like the whole forest was holding its breath. "All right, boys," Mr. Coldwell said, clapping his hands together. "Let's set up camp. Jack, why don't you and Thatcher go collect some firewood?" I nodded, grateful for the chance to talk to my friend alone. As soon as we were out of earshot, Thatcher turned to me, his face pale in the fading light. "Jack, we need to get out of here," he whispered urgently. "Something's not right. I saw something in the lake." I felt my heart rate pick up. "What do you mean? What did you see?" Thatcher shook his head, his eyes white with fear. "I don't know, man. It was just for a second, but I swear I saw faces in the water. Dozens of them, all staring up at us." I wanted to tell him he was crazy, that it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. I felt it too, the wrongness of this place, the sense that we were in terrible danger. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll wait until everyone's asleep, and we'll wake up Spork and Ziggy. The four of us can make a run for it, get help." Thatcher nodded, relief washing over his face. "Yeah, okay. That sounds like a plan." We gathered the firewood and headed back to camp, trying to act normal. But as we approached, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The camp was too quiet. What were the usual sounds of boys laughing, arguing over who got which tent? As we entered the clearing, my blood ran cold. Our entire troop was standing in a circle around the unlit fire pit, their backs to us. And at the center of the circle stood Mr. Coldwell, his pale eyes gleaming in the twilight. "Ah, Jack, Thatcher," he said, his voice sending shivers down my spine. "So good of you to join us. We've been waiting for you." As one, the other boys turned to face us. Their eyes were blank, pupilless, reflecting the same pale blue as Mr. Coldwell's. Even Spork and Ziggy, usually so full of life, stood motionless, their faces devoid of expression. "What's going on?" I managed to choke out, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. Mr. Coldwell's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed just a little too sharp. "Why, Jack, isn't it obvious? We're having an initiation, and you're the guest of honor." He gestured towards the lake, and I saw that the water was beginning to churn and bubble. Something was rising from its depths, something ancient and terrible. "You see, Jack," Mr. Coldwell continued, his voice taking on an otherworldly quality, "this lake has been waiting for a very long time. It needs fresh souls to sustain it, to keep it alive. And you, my boy, you have the purest soul I've seen in centuries." Centuries? My mind reeled, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. But as tentacles began to emerge from the lake, writhing and grasping at the air, I knew with horrifying certainty that this was all too real. "Run!" I screamed at Thatcher, shoving him towards the trees. We took off, crashing through the underbrush, the sounds that pursued close behind us. Branches whipped at my face, roots seemed to reach up to trip me, but I kept running. I could hear Thatcher's ragged breathing beside me, punctuated by sobs of terror. We ran for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker and more twisted around us. Finally, gasping for air, we collapsed behind a fallen tree. Did we lose them? Thatcher panted, his eyes wild with fear. I peered over the log, straining to see or hear any sign of our pursuers. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. "I think so," I whispered, not quite believing it myself. "But we need to keep moving. We have to find help, save the others." Thatcher nodded, wiping tears from his dirt-streaked face. "What about Spork and Ziggy? And Blink? We can't just leave them." The guilt hit me like a punch to the gut. In our panic to escape, we'd abandoned our friends to whatever horrific fate awaited them at that cursed lake. "We'll come back for them," I promised, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. "But first, we need to get out of these woods and find someone who can help." As we stumbled to our feet, a twig snapped somewhere behind us. We froze, hardly daring to breathe. "Jack? Thatcher?" It was Ziggy's voice, but there was something wrong with it. It sounded hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Where are you guys?" "Mr. Coldwell says it's time to come back now. The water's so nice and cool. Don't you want to join us?" I grabbed Thatcher's arm, ready to run again, but he was rooted to the spot, staring at something over my shoulder. Slowly, dreading what I might see, I turned around. Ziggy stood at the edge of a small clearing, his skin glowing faintly in the moonlight. But it wasn't really Ziggy anymore. His eyes were those same horrible pale blue, and his skin seemed to ripple and shift, as if something was moving beneath it. "Come on, guys," Ziggy said, his mouth stretching into an impossibly wide grin. "Everyone's waiting. It's time for you to become one with the lake." With a strangled cry, Thatcher broke free of my grip and took off running. I didn't hesitate, following close behind. The thing that used to be our friend let out an inhuman screech and gave chase. We ran blindly through the dark forest, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. I could hear more voices now, calling out to us with sweet promises and terrible threats. The voices of our friends, of Mr. Coldwell, and others, older, deeper voices that seemed to come from the earth itself. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, we burst out of the tree lane onto a dirt road. In the distance, I could see the glow of streetlights. There. I gasped, pointing. The town. We're almost there. But as we ran towards the lights, I realized something was wrong. The town looked off. The buildings were warped, the streets twisted at impossible angles. And the lights weren't the warm yellow of street lamps, but the same sickly pale blue as Mr. Coldwell's eyes. No, I moaned, the last shred of hope dying in my chest. This can't be happening. Thatcher grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin. "Jack," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Look." I followed his gaze and felt the bottom drop out of my world. Standing in the middle of the road, blocking our path, was Mr. Coldwell. But he wasn't human anymore, if he ever had been. His body had elongated, his arms now reaching the ground, ended in wicked claws. His mouth had split open, revealing row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. "Did you really think you could escape?" Mr. Coldwell's voice boomed, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "This is my domain, boys. The lake, the forest, the town, it's all part of me. And soon, you will be too." As he spoke, the road beneath our feet began to liquefy, turning into the same dark water we'd seen in the lake. I could feel it pulling at me, trying to drag me down. "Jack!" Thatcher screamed as he began to sink. I grabbed his hand, trying to pull him free, but the water was too strong. "Hold on!" I yelled, even as I felt myself being pulled under. The last thing I saw before the dark water closed over my head was Mr. Coldwell's triumphant grin. I woke up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat. My room was dark, the only light coming from the digital clock on my bedside table. 3:33 a.m. For a moment, I let myself believe it had all been a horrible nightmare. But then I felt it, a wetness on my skin that wasn't sweat. I turned on my lamp and looked down at my arms. They were covered in lake water, bits of algae clinging to my skin. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone, ready to call for help. But as I picked up the receiver, I heard a familiar voice on the other end. "Having trouble sleeping, Jack?" Mr. Coldwell's smooth voice purred. "Don't worry. The lake is waiting for you. It will always be waiting for you." I slammed the phone down, my heart pounding. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination, a waking nightmare. But as I sat there in my bed, shivering despite the summer heat, I knew the truth. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some kind of mass hallucination. Maybe we'd eaten some bad berries, or been exposed to some kind of toxic gas in the forest. But deep down, I knew better. My parents were concerned, of course. Their son had disappeared into the woods with his scout troop and emerged 3 days later, babbling about monsters and living lakes. The other boys who'd made it back, and there were only a few of us, told similar stories. We were all subjected to medical tests, psychological evaluations, even hypnosis. But in the end, the official story was that we'd gotten lost in the woods and our minds had played tricks on us. But I knew the truth. And so did Thatcher, Spork, and Blink, the only other survivors of that horrific night. We may have packed never to speak of what really happened, but I could see the knowledge weighing on them, just as it weighed on me. The nightmares continued. Every night, I found myself back at that lake, watching as my friends were dragged into its murky depths. Sometimes I was the one doing the dragging, my body no longer my own. I'd wake up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat and something that smelled suspiciously like lake water. Months passed. The town tried to move on, to forget the tragedy of the lost Boy Scout troop. A new leader was appointed, and the surviving boys were encouraged to rejoin. But none of us did. How could we, knowing what we knew? It was a crisp fall day when I saw him again. I was walking home from school, kicking through piles of fallen leaves, when I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. I looked up and there he was, standing on the corner across the street. Mr. Coldwell. He looked exactly the same, tall, pale, with those unsettling blue eyes. He smiled at me, a smile that was all wrong, too wide and full of too many teeth. Then he raised a hand and beckoned to me. I ran. I ran all the way home and locked myself in my room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. When my parents finally coaxed me out, I told them I'd seen a stranger who scared me. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. But that was just the beginning. I started seeing him everywhere, in the crowd at the grocery store, lurking at the edge of the school playground, standing outside my window at night. Sometimes he looked human. Other times, not so much. The others saw him too. Thatcher called me one night, his voice shaking, to tell me he'd seen Mr. Coldwell in his backyard, just standing there, staring at his window. Spork's parents ended up moving away after he had a complete breakdown at school, screaming that the walls were melting into water. I tried to be strong, to convince myself that it wasn't real. But how do you fight something that can twist reality itself? How do you escape when the very town you live in might be part of a monster? As winter set in, bringing with it long, dark nights, I found myself sleeping less and less. I was afraid of what I might see in my dreams, afraid that one night I might not wake up at all. My grades started to slip, and I withdrew from my friends, what few I had left. It all came to a head on a snowy night in December. I was home alone, my parents at a Christmas party. As I sat in the living room, trying to focus on my homework, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the slow, rhythmic drip of water. I looked up, my heart in my throat, to see water seeping in under the front door. But it wasn't normal water. It was dark, almost black, and it moved with a purpose, creeping across the floor towards me. I jumped up, knocking over my chair in my haste. The dripping sound grew louder, and I realized with horror that it was coming from everywhere, the windows, the walls, even the ceiling. The house was being invaded by the lake. "No," I whispered, backing away. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But I could smell it now, that unmistakable scent of stagnant water and decay that I remembered so vividly from that cursed camping trip. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, the water began to take shape. Tendrils rose from the growing puddles, reaching for me with terrifying intent. I turned to run, only to find my path blocked by a familiar figure. Mr. Coldwell stood in the doorway, his pale eyes gleaming with triumph. "Did you really think you could escape, Jack?" he asked, his voice echoing strangely in the waterlogged room. "The lake has chosen you. It's time to come home." I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything but stand there frozen as the water crept up my legs. But my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was trapped in one of my nightmares, helpless to do anything but watch as the horror unfolded. Just as the water reached my waist, there was a pounding at the front door. "Jack! Jack, are you in there? It was Thatcher's voice, filled with panic. The sound of my friend's voice broke whatever spell had been holding me. With a desperate lunge, I broke free of the water's grasp and ran for the door, sloshing through the ankle-deep water that now covered the floor. I yanked the door open to find Thatcher standing there, his face pale and drawn. "We have to go," he gasped. "Now. They're coming for all of us." I didn't need to ask who they were. I could see the fear in Thatcher's eyes, the same fear that had haunted me for months. Without a word, I grabbed my coat and followed him out into the snowy night. As we ran down the street, I could hear the sound of rushing water behind us. I dared to glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The entire street was flooded, a dark tide that was quickly gaining on us. And in the midst of it all, I could see figures moving distorted, in human shapes that might once have been our fellow scouts. "This way," Thatcher yelled, pulling me down a side street. "Spork and Blink are waiting for us. We have a plan." "A plan?" I wanted to ask what kind of plan could possibly save us from this nightmare, but I was too out of breath to speak. We ran through the deserted streets, the sound of pursuit always just behind us. Finally, we arrived at an old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. Spork and Blink were there, looking just as terrified as I felt. They had a car, an old beater that looked like it had seen better days. "Get in," Spork yelled, already behind the wheel. We piled in, and Spork gunned the engine before I'd even closed my door. As we sped out of town, I finally found my voice. "What's going on? Where are we going?" Blink turned to me, his usually quiet demeanor replaced by grim determination. "We're getting out of here, Jack. For good. This town, it's not right. It hasn't been right since that camping trip. We think the whole place is under the lake's influence now." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. But what about our families? We can't just leave them. Thatcher put a hand on my shoulder. "We don't have a choice, man. It's too late for them. If we stay, we'll end up just like the others." I wanted to argue, to insist that we go back and try to save everyone. But deep down, I knew they were right. Whatever had happened at that lake, whatever Mr. Coldwell really was, it had infected our entire town. And we were the only ones who could see it. As we drove through the night, leaving behind everything we'd ever known, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The lake had chosen us for a reason, and I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't going to let us go so easily. Hours passed, and as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe we had escaped. Maybe we were finally free. But then Spork, who had been quiet for the last hour, spoke up. "Guys," he said, his voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first, I didn't hear anything over the rumble of the car's engine. But then I caught it, a faint but unmistakable sound. Grip. 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 I looked down in horror to see water seeping out from the floorboards of the car. Dark, murky water that smelled of rot and decay. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." Blink let out a strangled cry. "Look." We all turned to see what he was pointing at. There, in the rearview mirror, was a sight that made my heart stop. The road behind us was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of dark water. And rising from that water, growing larger with every second, was a massive wave. At its crest, I could see a figure. Even at this distance, I recognized the toulon limbs, the pale skin, the inhuman grin of Mr. Coldwell. "Drive faster!" Thatcher screamed, but it was too late. The wave was upon us, lifting our small car as if it weighed nothing. As the water crashed over us, as I felt myself being pulled under once again, I had one last, terrifying thought. The lake had never let us go. We had never escaped. And now, it was claiming us for good. The world dissolved into darkness and the rush of water. I could feel the car being tossed about like a toy, could hear the muffled screams of my friends. Then, silence. A silence so complete it was almost deafening. I don't know how long I floated in that darkness. It could have been seconds, or it could have been years. Time seemed to have no meaning in this watery limbo. Eventually, I became aware of a light. Faint at first, but growing stronger. I swam towards it, driven by some instinct I didn't fully understand. As I got closer, I could make out shapes moving in the light. Familiar shapes. I broke the surface with a gasp, my lungs burning as they filled with air. I was back in the lake, the cursed lake where it had all begun. Around me, I could see the other boys from our troop, all of them looking just as confused and terrified as I felt. And there, standing on the shore, was Mr. Coldwell. But he wasn't alone. Next to him stood a figure that made my blood run cold. It was me. Or rather, it was what I might become if I gave in to the lake's power. "Welcome home, Jack," Mr. Coldwell said, his voice carrying easily across the water. "You've been gone for so long, but the lake never forgot you. It's time to take your place among us." As he spoke, I felt something brush against my leg. I looked down to see tentacles rising from the depths, wrapping around my body. But strangely, I wasn't afraid anymore. There was a part of me, a growing part, that wanted to give in. To join with the lake and become something more than human. But another part of me, the part that was still Jack, the boy who loved camping and ghost stories and his friends, rebelled against this. With every ounce of willpower I had left, I fought against the lake's pull. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "This isn't real. None of this is real." Mr. Coldwell's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, but it is, Jack. More real than anything you've ever known. Why fight it? Embrace the lake, embrace your true nature." I closed my eyes, concentrating hard. This was my mind, my reality. I didn't have to accept this nightmare. With a supreme effort of will, I imagined myself back in my room, safe and dry. When I opened my eyes, I was there. Sitting up in my bed, drenched in sweat but blessedly free of lake water. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it had all been a terrible dream. But then I saw it. On my bedside table, where it certainly hadn't been when I went to sleep, was a small, smooth stone. A lake stone. And carved into its surface was a simple message. "We'll be waiting." I knew then that this wasn't over. The lake, Mr. Coldwell, whatever forces were at work here, they weren't done with me. Maybe they would never be done with me. But I also knew that I wasn't alone in this fight. Somewhere up there, Thatcher, Spork, and Blink were facing the same battle. And maybe, just maybe, if we stood together, we could find a way to truly escape the lake's grasp. As I sat there in the early morning light, turning the stone over in my hands, I made a decision. I wouldn't run anymore. I wouldn't hide. It was time to face this nightmare head-on, to find out the truth about Mr. Coldwell, the lake, and why we had been chosen. The hunt was on. And this time, I wouldn't be the prey. Little did I know, this decision would lead me down a path darker and more terrifying than anything I had experienced so far. The true nature of the lake, the cosmic horror that lurked beneath its placid surface, was something my young mind could scarcely comprehend. As I sat there, the lake stone cold in my palm, a grim determination settled over me. I knew what I had to do. I spent the next week preparing, gathering supplies and steeling my nerves. I left a note for my parents, telling them I loved them and not to worry. Then, in the dead of night, I slipped out of my house and made my way to the edge of town. Thatcher, Spork, and Blink were waiting for me, just as we planned. None of us spoke as we piled into Spork's old car. We all knew what was at stake. The drive back to the campsite was tense, filled with a heavy silence. As we neared our destination, the air grew thick and oppressive, just as it had that fateful summer. We parked at the trailhead and continued on foot, each step taking us closer to the nightmare we tried so hard to escape. The forest seemed to close in around us, branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Finally, we emerged at the shore of the lake. It looked deceptively peaceful in the pale moonlight, but we knew better. We could feel the malevolence radiating from its depths. "Are you sure about this, Jack?" Thatcher whispered, his voice trembling slightly. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. We had discussed this at length. There was only one way to end this, to free ourselves and our town from the lake's influence. We had to destroy it at its source. We began the ritual we had pieced together from old books and internet forums. It was dangerous, forbidden knowledge, but it was our only hope. As we chanted, the lake began to churn. A thick mist rose from its surface, coalescing into the familiar form of Mr. Coldwell. "You foolish children," he hissed, his form flickering between human and something far more terrifying. "You have no idea what forces you're dealing with." We didn't falter. We couldn't. As our chant reached its crescendo, the ground began to shake. The lake's waters receded, revealing glimpses of the horrors that dwelled in its depths. Mr. Coldwell lunged at us, his form now fully monstrous. But as he reached the edge of our ritual circle, he dissolved into mist. A piercing shriek filled the air as the lake began to collapse in on itself. The trees around us groaned and twisted, reality itself seeming to warp. "We need to go." Spork yelled over the cacophony. "This whole place is coming apart." We ran, the world unraveling behind us. I could hear human voices calling my name, begging me to stay, to join them in the depths. But I didn't look back. We barely made it to the car before the wave of unreality caught up with us. Spork floored it, and we sped away as the forest behind us was swallowed by a void of nothingness. We drove through the night, not stopping until we were several states away. When we finally pulled over at a rest stop, the sun was just beginning to rise. We sat there in silence for a long while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Blink spoke up. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. I looked down at my hand, where the lake stone had been. It was gone, dissolved into nothing. In that moment, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. "Yeah," I said, allowing myself a small smile. "I think it is." We never went back to our hometown. We couldn't. The official story was that a sinkhole had opened up, swallowing the forest and lake. The town was evacuated, declared uninhabitable. We went our separate ways after that, each trying to build a new life far from the memories of that cursed summer. But we stayed in touch, bound by the shared trauma we could never fully explain to anyone else. Years passed. The nightmares faded, becoming little more than a distant, unpleasant memory. I convinced myself that it was over, that we had won. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself looking out at the horizon, half expecting to see a familiar figure standing there, pale eyes gleaming in the darkness. And I wonder, with a chill running down my spine, if we really destroyed the lake, or if we just postponed the inevitable. Because deep down, in a place I try not to acknowledge, I can still hear it calling. The lake. Mr. Coldwell. The things that lurk in the spaces between reality. And sometimes, God help me, I want to answer. But I don't. I won't. That chapter of my life is closed, the book sealed shut. Whatever cosmic horror we glimpsed that summer, whatever eldritch truths we briefly touched, they're better left in the past. I'm an adult now, with a family of my own. I've never told them about what happened, and I never will. Some truths are too terrible to share. But if you're reading this, if you've made it this far, let my story be a warning. Be careful of still waters and too perfect lakes. Be wary of those whose smiles never reach their eyes. And if you ever find yourself faced with a horror too great to comprehend, run. Run, and don't look back. Because not everyone is as lucky as we were. Not everyone escapes the lake. My wife and I have always lived a quiet life in the country with our son, Wesley. Our 9-acre property is surrounded to the north and the east by a forest, where Wesley would often go play with his friends or by himself. For his 8th birthday, I had gone into the forest with Wesley to help him make his own tree fort where he could stash his comic books, Game Boy, toys, and treasures that he would find while exploring the woods behind our house. He amassed quite a collection of interesting rocks and bugs, which he stored in mason jars in his forest base, and he spent most of his free time just a few hundred yards away from our house. It was a peaceful life that we had for ourselves. I would take our car into work on the weekdays and bring my wife to town right after Wesley's bus arrived to take him to school. Each day was the same routine, and we spent the weekends together at the house. In short, we were all very happy. This week is the 6th anniversary of my son, Wesley's, disappearance. To this day, we don't know what happened to him on that brisk autumn evening, but from the moment our 12-year-old son left the house, we had a sneaking suspicion he was never coming back. On Friday, August 23rd, 2013, our daily morning ritual happened as it always had. I would wake up, eat breakfast with Kim and Wesley, and we would wait together until the bus arrived. Wesley had a half day at school today, so he would return home before me or my wife were able to get home and watch him. This wasn't a big deal. He was 12 and could look after himself for a few hours. We told him to call my cell phone as soon as he got home after school that day to make sure he was home safely. As Wes climbed up the stairs onto the bus, my wife began to tremble and eventually break into tears. Neither of us knew what she was crying for, but we waved our son goodbye and both climbed into the car to finish off the work week. My cell phone rang at exactly 12:33 that afternoon. My iPhone played the default marimba tone and I saw that I was receiving a call from our home landline. It must have been Wesley, who had just gotten off the bus and ran into our home, obeying my instructions to call. When I slid my finger across the screen and answered the phone, the only thing I heard was the empty dial tone of our home landline, as if he hadn't typed out my number yet. I called out his name a few times through my cell, but there was nothing. I tried calling back, but there was no answer. He did as he was instructed, called Dad as soon as he got home, and must have sprinted out the door to go play in the woods. I thought nothing of it until I got home. I picked up my wife from the store on the way back to the house. The porch lights were on, which was our family's way of indirectly saying, "Someone's home." Upon entering our house, I called out to Wesley to see if he was in his room. I got no response, so I assumed he was still outside in the woods, even 5 hours after his call. My kid always loved that fort that I built him. Kim began making dinner and I changed my clothes and went to the spot in the woods where my son and I had constructed his home away from home. It was starting to get dark, so it was a bit difficult to see through the woods. I spotted the light from his treehouse lamp on through the window and, as a dad should, began silently creeping up the short ladder nailed into the tree to scare the crap out of him. When I reached the top, I quickly swung the curtain door open and let out a roar in an attempt to scare my poor, unexpecting son. However, after scanning the small room, Wesley wasn't sitting in his beanbag chair as he normally was. In fact, the chair and his entire collections of rocks, bugs, comics, and games were completely gone off of the wooden shelves. The only things in the room were the lit citronella camping lamp that we had given to him when we built the treehouse, and a single Skechers sneaker lying in the middle of the room. The shoe was facing the doorway. I walked over to pick it up and examined it in the light of the treehouse lamp. Nothing was unusual about it, but it was Wesley's. I peeked out the window, wondering where my son could have run off to with only one shoe. The darkness had started to creep over the entire forest, and it would be very dark in no time. I called out into the twilight several times, with no response. He was probably waiting and hiding to scare me, and it was working. I was terrified already. I left the lamp on and descended the ladder of the treehouse, continuing to scan the dim area for my son. I called and searched for 30 minutes in the dark, getting no response. I was beginning to panic. Sprinting back in the direction of our home, I noticed that the light in his room was on. A wave of calm and relaxation washed over me. He must have snuck home while I was out here searching for him, little bugger. I opened the back door and entered the kitchen, immediately greeted by my wife, asking about the shoe in my hand and where her little Wesley was. I explained what happened, and she told me he hadn't come home. Once again beginning to panic, I sprinted down the hallway to his room and flung the door open. The light to the room was off, and the interior was completely bare. I know that I saw his light on when I was returning home from the woods. I flipped the light on with my right hand, still clutching his sneaker with my left. The room was completely empty. His bed, dresser, posters, rug, and bookshelf were completely gone. My wife heard my scream and came instantly rushing to my side. Then she screamed too. We didn't scream at anything we saw, but by the complete lack of something that was before us. Wesley and his possessions were nowhere to be seen, besides the shoe that I clutched. Examining it once more in the bare light of his room, a single word had appeared on the sole of his shoe, but only when viewing it in his room. The word didn't appear anywhere else in the house, only his room. The word though was clearly visible in black block letters on its bottom. Kim immediately called the police and reported a theft, kidnapping, missing child, breaking and entering, everything. I had already grabbed a flashlight and was combing the woods, looking for any signs of my missing child. The police arrived, and I told them everything that had happened. The police helped us search the woods and surrounding area for hours. We searched for days, then weeks, months. Wesley never returned to our house. Once a week I would visit his hideout in the woods, which was now overgrown from the months spent untouched, and I left food and water in hopes that he was hiding somewhere in the woods, but the food just sat on the floor, rotting and filling with bugs. The time blended together, and we began to gradually lose hope of ever seeing our boy again. An entire year passed, and I continued to make weekly trips to the hideout just in case he would someday return. August 23rd, Wesley's disappearance anniversary, landed on a Saturday in 2014. I reclined in silent mourning on my love seat while I recalled the events of exactly 1 year ago. As I sat on the couch, my cell phone rang. The caller ID was our home landline, but I looked over to see our clunky phone set in its home on the dock. No one was using it. The time on the clock next to it read 12:33. I frantically answered the phone, hoping to hear something, anything. Dial tone. Just like 1 year ago. Today I had brought Wesley's favorite snack, Cheetos, and an Arnold Palmer sweet tea to bring to his hideout, but I forgot them on the counter as I sprinted out of the house. It didn't matter. I climbed the ladder of the fort and flung the curtain open. It had smelled bad because of the rotten bread that I had left last week, but I would take last week's meal back to the house whenever I left. Half expecting to see the bare room as I had every single week following his disappearance, the long burnt-out citronella lamp flared on with my entrance, revealing the object sitting in front of me. Wesley's other shoe, once again facing the door. In stunned astonishment, I scooped up the shoe, examining it for another word. Once again recalling 1 year ago, I sprinted as fast as I could back to the house. The light of his room was mysteriously on. I blazed past him in the kitchen and beelined straight to Wesley's room. I paused for a moment outside the door, noticing that no light was visible under it, the same as it was 1 year ago. I opened the door as Tim ran down the hall and followed me. She realized what I had discovered, and together we shared the same mixture of anguish and hope as I flipped on the light switch. The empty sole of the shoe now displayed another single word, bother. We looked at each other in silence as the tears streamed down our faces. I placed the shoe next to its partner in the center of the room, reading the phrase, "Don't bother." Each year since, my wife and I have found another piece of Wesley's clothing in the treehouse. The clues only appeared on August 23rd, after I received the phantom phone call from our home landline at exactly 12:33. When I received the call in 2015, I had requested the day off from work. I waited, with phone in hand, at the bottom of the ladder of the treehouse. As soon as my expected call rang, answered, and repeated the dial tone, I had flung myself up the ladder into the treehouse. Same scene as before. Curtain open, light on, an object in the middle of the floor. This time, Wesley's pants lay on the floor, feet facing the door. Grabbing them and sprinting to his room felt all too familiar. I flipped the light on once again and read the next word on them, printed this time on the butt of the jeans. This year, the word was lucky. August 23rd, 2016. It became tradition for me on these days to miss all other obligations. I wanted to figure out this mystery of my son. The time was 12:32, and I sat cross-legged in the empty hideout, waiting as the seconds ticked by until the inevitable phone call. To my surprise, my phone clock ticked to 12:33, and no call arrived. I waited for another minute, then 5, then 10 minutes. Giving up, I descended the ladder. Once my feet touched the ground, my phone instantly rang. Home landline. Repeat last year, the curtain, lamp, and object. This year was Wesley's shirt. The same striped, long-sleeved t-shirt I had last seen him in. In his bedroom, I read the next word, printed across the back, fur. I already dreaded what next year would bring. I knew that the next word was going to be him. Some sadistic asshole had kidnapped my son and stole all of his possessions, and now they were toying with me, throwing in my face the fact that I completely failed as a father. August 23rd, 2017. I waited outside the hideout for the call once again. I stood on the tiny deck in front of the curtain until I received the call, but it never came. It seemed that nothing would happen until I was completely on the ground, away from the treehouse. I climbed down the ladder, received the call, and returned to the fort. Wesley's underwear. This was a bit messed up, if you ask me. However, each article of clothing I had retrieved from the fort was completely clean, as if it was washed that day. The underwear was no exception. Returning to his room, my hunch upon the next word was completely proved wrong. Me. Placing the underwear next to the rest of the clothing, I read the words in order. Don't bother looking for me. Now, it's 2018 and my son's disappearance anniversary, if you can call it that, was 3 days ago. Nothing showed up in the treehouse. No phone calls. No clothing, I checked. Nothing new was added to this puzzle of his disappearance. I checked his room last night to see the 5 pieces of clothing in the room as I did quite often, but nothing was there. On the 6th anniversary of his disappearance, all the articles disappeared. No one could have taken them. I had boarded up the window to Wesley's room and locked the door 3 times over. Those clothes were the last mementos that me and Kim had of our little boy, and now they were gone, too. Marlene was my very first friend, as well as my first love. When I grew up, I had no real friends. I guess I was a bit too odd. I was always dreaming, had my head in the clouds, and was living in a world of my own. During summer break, I didn't go to the local soccer field and hang out with the other kids. No, I was always on my own, exploring the vast forest behind my home. Out there, I imagined myself the king of the forest and would go on magical adventures with imaginary friends. It was by sheer accident that I found the treehouse. It was a strange construction, nestled between a bunch of close-standing trees and almost completely hidden by their heavy trunks. To say I was excited would be an understatement. I felt as if I'd uncovered the biggest secret of the forest, and I'd done it all on my own. As I stood there, I was apprehensive. Who knows who the place belonged to? For long minutes I scanned the forest to see if anyone was nearby. When no one showed up, I got closer and moved up the small hidden ladder, leaning against it. The place was old, the wood dirty and withered, but it was also surprisingly sturdy and much bigger than I thought from the outside. I'd hoped it would be filled with hidden treasures, magical items, or other similar things only kids can think of. Instead, all I found were 2 empty bottles, a piece of clothing, and a dirty, discolored blanket. The moment I picked it up, a strange smell reached my nose. Disgusted, I threw it into the furthest corner, and a few moments later, I pushed the rest of the items there as well. It was at this moment that I decided that this treehouse would be my new hideout. Over the next couple of days, though, I was still apprehensive. I was constantly scanning the area around the treehouse via the small cracks in its walls. Yet no one ever showed up. Eventually, I grew more relaxed and filled new hideout with my favorite things. Toys, comics, and snacks. Standing in front of my new secret forest home and all the treasures I brought there, I nodded to myself and felt incredibly proud. I'd been hanging out at the treehouse for about a week when I met her for the first time. A voice reached my ears while I was reading a comic book and munching on a Milky Way bar. I jerked up. "Who are you?" "I quiet," high-pitched voice asked. I carefully made my way to the entrance and peeked outside. A girl with long dark hair, about my age, was standing there, right in front of the treehouse. "I'm Andy," I answered her. Then I realized that this treehouse had to be hers. "Oh no, I'm sorry. I didn't know this place belonged to someone." "It's not my place either," she brought out. I gave her a nod. "Hey, do you want to read some Spider-Man? I asked her, and, without waiting for an answer, I rushed back inside to find my very favorite Spider-Man comic book. When I returned to the entrance, mere moments later, she was gone. And so I stood there, all on my own, wondering about that strange little girl. And so I stood there, wondering where that strange little girl had gone before I went back to my comic books. Still, as much as I read of Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk, I couldn't stop thinking about her. From that day onward, I spent every single one of the long summer afternoons out at the treehouse. I guess I was lonely after all and hoped to meet her again. Eventually, she appeared at the treehouse again, coming out of nowhere like she'd done before. I learned her name was Marlene, and that she was a year younger than me. Over the course of that single afternoon, we became quick friends, and soon enough my feelings for her turned from friendship to something more. She wasn't there a lot, but whenever she was, I stayed until the early evening. During those hours, we'd talk about everything, about school, about TV, and of course, about comic books. There was one thing, however, I wondered about. If she was playing out here, she had to be from around the area, and yet, I'd never seen her at school, never seen her around town before. Eventually, I'd mustered up the courage and asked her the question I'd been wanting to ask for days. Hey, Marlene, do you live around her? I thought if you did, then maybe we could, I could walk you home in case I broke up, cursing at myself for rambling on like an idiot. She smiled at me, but for the first time, her smile was different. I live far away, she eventually brought out in a weak voice. But if you live far away, how do you come here? She was quiet for a while, and her eyes turned from me toward the forest, as if they were searching for something. It's not important, she finally said. I wanted to press the issue, but of course I couldn't muster up the courage. Even worse, the way she talked about it. I couldn't help but wonder if she was mad at me. So instead of talking, I buried my face in my comics. On my way home, I told myself that I was stupid and that I'd ruined it all. She wouldn't be back now, would she? Out of fear and my mind busy with all things related to first love, I couldn't muster up the courage to return to the treehouse for an entire week. When I finally went back, I found the snacks I'd left gone, the comic books torn apart, and the toys broken and discarded. As I stared at the place that had been my secret little hideout and at my destroyed treasures, I felt the tears coming to my eyes. Someone had found the place and had destroyed it. And then another thought came to my mind, one far worse that stabbed at my young heart. What if it had been Marlene? What if she hated me? You can't come here anymore, I suddenly heard a voice from outside. Marlene. I called out as I jumped down the little ladder and raced to meet her. When I saw her face, however, my steps slowed down before I came to a halt. Leave, Andy, and you can never come back here. But why? I asked, and even though I fought against them, I felt tears coming to my eyes. She was quiet. Once more, her eyes wandered from me to the surrounding forest. This place, it belongs to a very bad man. I thought he was gone, but he's back now. My eyes darted around before I picked up a stick, holding it in my hands like a sword. You don't have to worry about him. I'll protect you. I brought out in my best rendition of what I thought was a tough guy voice. She smiled when I said this, but it was the same smile I'd seen before. One that was sad and wary. That's sweet, Andy, really sweet, but you can't, she brought out after a long while. I was about to protest again, but she cut me off right away, telling me again that I had to leave, that I couldn't come back, and pressed me repeatedly to promise her. And so I did. Even though I was a boy who was in love. A few days later, I set out for the treehouse and for Marlene again. When I reached the treehouse, I found it empty, and so I turned and started calling for Marlene. I was desperate, lonely, and missed her dearly. When the bushes nearby started shifting, my eyes grew wide and my mouth changed to a smile. Marlene, I started, but my voice broke up when a bearish man pushed himself from the bushes. What are you doing here, you little shit? He called out to me. He was unkempt and his clothes were dirty. In an instant, fear washed over me. His boots sounded hard on the forest floor as quick steps led him towards me. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask who he was and to apologize for having come here. But his face, contorted by rage, and his wild eyes pushed me into a state of panic. "I'm sorry," was all I could bring out before I turned and ran. After only a handful of steps, I felt a big hard hand getting a hold of me. I felt myself being turned around and pushed to the ground. "Thought you could run away, didn't you?" he asked with a mad grin. I screamed, called for help, tried to fight, but he was so much bigger and stronger than me. He pushed one of his hands over my mouth and brought his face closer to mine. "No, you'll stay right here," he whispered into my ear. His breath stank and was heavy with something reminiscent of medicine. As he dragged me towards the treehouse, I fought again, tried to get free, but it seemed futile. Somehow, though, I could free my mouth and bit down on his fingers. A quiet curse escaped his mouth before he started laughing again. Then he pulled out a knife and held it up in front of my face. "You want to try this again, boy?" he asked, waving it around. A whimper escaped my mouth, and I desperately tried to shake my head. When the point of the knife dug into the skin on my cheek, I started crying, and a second later my bladder gave way. The man burst into laughter, and with one swift motion, he pulled me up into the treehouse and threw me into a corner. My head hit the side of a trunk with such force, dark spots appeared in front of my eyes. As I lay there, all the strength left my body, and all I could do was to curl up into a ball. In front of me, the man was staring at his knife, then back at me, then back at the knife before a manic grin appeared on his face. "We're going to have a lot of fun together. Oh yeah, we'll," but he broke up. The manic grin on his face had vanished and was replaced by an expression of first confusion and then terror. "You? But how can you dash?" "No, get away, he began screaming. At that moment, I noticed a blurry figure out of the corner of my eye. It was hovering over the floor. I saw torn cloths, long dangling arms, and dirty hair. Before I could make sense of the situation, the figure dashed forward at the man. I watched as he lifted his arm, waved the knife, as he retreated backward. "No, get away," he screamed in sheer and utter terror. The figure screeched up, releasing a terrifying, high-pitched sound, and in that moment, I saw the man falling backward as he tumbled down the small ladder. There was a sickening crunch before silence returned to the forest. A moment later, the ghastly apparition turned in my direction. As it did, it sank to the floor. Its arms grew smaller, thinner. The hair became normal and torn clothes seemed to patch themselves back together. Then I found myself face to face with Marlene again. "What is?" I started, but broke up when I saw the look of misery on her face. "That's why I didn't want you to come here, Andy," she brought out. "But how did you do this? How did you dash? Go, Andy. This time you have to go for real. This place, it's a bad place, a very bad place." As she said this, she reached out to me with her hand. When I took it, it felt so small in mine, small and icy cold. I looked up, and when I stared at her, I saw the tears in her eyes. I wanted to say something, Wanted desperately to tell her how I felt about her, that everything was going to be okay, but I couldn't. She led me to the entrance of the treehouse and then outside. For a moment I cringed when I saw the terrible man at the bottom of the ladder, his neck twisted and broken. "He won't hurt you anymore," Marlene brought out. "He won't hurt anyone anymore," she added soon after. "Then it doesn't matter, does it? It means I can return and we can dash." "No," she brought out, shaking her head, giving me that same sad look. "This is wrong. It's all wrong. This place, this, here, all of it," she mumbled. "Marlene," I started, reaching out for her. "No," she suddenly screeched at me, brushing my hand aside. Then my eyes grew wide as she transformed again and watched her turning into a terrible apparition. When I saw her ghastly face, the empty eyes, the wide open mouth and those long, dangling arms, all I could do was to run and never look back. I didn't know what happened that day, and I didn't understand what had happened to Marlene and how she turned into this thing. The answers I sought soon came to me. It wasn't long before someone found the bad man's body. He was soon identified as a convicted child molester, and when they checked the treehouse, they soon uncovered much more about him. Marlene had been right. That tree, it really was a terrible place. Below the tree I'd played it for so many days and weeks, they found the buried remains of 4 children. When I saw the newspaper article, and I also saw the pictures of his victims. 2 were young boys. One was a girl with blonde hair, but the last was a little girl with dark hair and about my age. It was a little girl I knew very well. I want to start off by saying I'm not looking for any answers regarding my strange childhood. I just need to tell somebody who won't look at me like I'm crazy. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe I am looking for answers. At this point, I don't know. I've never told anyone about the events that shaped my childhood for years. I hadn't even told my parents. I just spoke with them today, and I think it's time I tell them everything. I just graduated college, and they thought it was time they tell me something they had to keep hidden from me as a child. In regards to me and my younger sister, in 2012, an investigation of a stalker began, and it's still an active investigation. When I was young, my family didn't have anywhere to call home for more than a year at a time. We moved a lot. When I got older, I learned this was due to many financial issues my parents were trying to deal with. We lived in apartments, townhomes, wherever we could afford to. It was around the age of 10 that we finally were able to buy a home. I remember my parents were adamant that the house needed to be cleaned up and have some things fixed before we moved in. A painstakingly long drive through the Colorado mountains accompanied moving day. It didn't help that we drove during a light blizzard, but I didn't care. I absolutely loved the snow, and as we got higher in elevation, I was ecstatic to see the snowflakes grow in size. How much longer? My younger sister, Madeline, groaned from the seat next to me. It should actually be right off of this road, just a few miles up. My mom said, trying to keep the car steady while my dad followed in a moving truck. I hope the neighbors have kids too, I said with so much curiosity. I had never had friends for longer than a school year. The idea of having one, knowing I wasn't going to leave next summer, was what excited me the most. We turned onto a tiny road that connected to the middle of nowhere highway. At the end sat a lone house in the middle of a snow-covered field. Where are the other houses? I asked with a hint of disappointment in my breath. It's just us. Your dad found us an amazing deal on this place. All of this is ours too, my mom said as she gestured to the empty field surrounding us. She looked back at me through the rearview mirror. I think she could see the disappointment in my eyes. "Oh, honey. I know you're excited for a new city and friends close by, but we're not too far out of town, and from what I've heard, the school here is fantastic. I'm sure you'll make lots of friends." As I grabbed my backpack from the truck, Madeline charged past me to be the first one inside. I couldn't let her beat me. I ran after her through the ankle-high snow, but I was too late. She had already made it in and left the front door swinging in the wind. As I stepped inside, I heard Madeline yell from upstairs. "This room is mine. This one's mine." I found the stairs to the right of the front door and ran up to claim my room. That was a pretty easy task, as there were only 2 rooms upstairs apart from the bathroom that connected the 2. As Madeline sang and danced from her room, I peeked into the second room. It was bigger than any room I ever had before. It had something else I had never had in a room before. A little door at the far end of the wall. "I see you found the secret room," my dad said as he hauled boxes past me. I opened the door and tried to make out the second room through the darkness. It was maybe a fourth of the size of my room. The walls and floor were made from unfinished wood, and it had a light bulb that dangled on a cord from the ceiling. "No way. Evan, look outside," Madeline yelled from her room. I peered through the window. In the middle of a snow-plastered field was a single, giant oak tree with a treehouse built around it. It wasn't your standard idea of a treehouse either. It was built in a circular shape around the tree, about 15 feet high. It even had an outdoor deck that extended further out. I ran downstairs to find my mother. "Mom, can we go to the treehouse?" I could hardly contain my excitement. "Well, that treehouse is one thing your dad and I haven't had the chance to check out yet. We don't know how old that wood is or how safe it is for you guys." I could feel that same wave of disappointment wash over again. "How about this? If you give it a few days for the snow to pass, me and your dad will put that treehouse inspection at the very tip-top of our list." A week to the day passed, and my parents deemed the treehouse safe. I still remember that feeling in my chest as we made our way down the path to the treehouse. That feeling of excitement only a child truly knows. Madeline and I stood in awe underneath the giant oak. A swinging ladder made of rope and would hung near the center. "Ladies first," I said, gesturing Madeline towards the ladder. "No way, I'm going after you. I know if it can hold you, it can hold like 3 of me." "Are you calling me fat?" I questioned. "Yes." I stumbled over my own frustration for a moment. "I'm not fat. Mom says it's just my metabolism. She said I get it from Grandpa." I was fat. Despite the harsh criticisms of my weight, I was happy to be first in the treehouse. I placed my foot on the first plank of wood and made my way up. About halfway up the rope began to swing against my way. It was nerve-wracking at first, but I soon found myself sitting in the entrance. "What's it like up there?" Madeline yelled from below. I don't know. It looks like there was a bunch of stuff left up here." As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw a flashlight sitting close by on the wooden floor. I picked it up and miraculously, it still had some juice in it. Through the flickering beam of light, I inspected the room. A cabinet sat to the left of me. To the right was a wall littered with band posters from the late 80s, most of which I wouldn't recognize until later in life. There was only one window in the treehouse. It sat within the door that led to the wrap-around deck. The light that shined into the room displayed one final piece. A wooden table and bench set. It was beautifully made. It was obviously handmade. Spiraling patterns were sanded into benches, both mirroring each other perfectly. Sitting on the table was an absurd amount of art supplies. "Whoa, no way," Madeline exclaimed as she pushed past me. I forgot my paint set when I was packing, but look at this. She was astonished. Ever since Madeline was able to hold a brush, she was considered the artist of the family. Honestly, for a 7-year-old, she was pretty talented. Her eyes gazed over the table until, "What is this?" she said, placing her finger on the end of the table. It was a weird symbol. 3 points jutted from the center and spun outward, clockwise. It was carefully carved into the wood and filled with a baby blue paint. We didn't think much of it. I got thirsty and left Madeline alone to get water and talk with my mother about the treehouse. "Have you been out on the deck yet?" she asked. I shook my head. "Well, when you go back, you and Madeline should really check it out. It's got quite the view." I began to make my way back, following the trail my parents had made in the snow. I placed Madeline's water bottle in my jeans pocket and quickly climbed the ladder. "Hey, Mom said we needed to look at the dash." I paused. Madeline sat on the floor, sobbing. What happened? Her eyes were full of something heavier than fear. She didn't respond. "Madeline." She looked at me and said with a hint of dread in her voice, "I want to go inside." "What happened?" She looked up at me from her red, tear-soaked eyes. "Someone talked to me," she said in a soft whisper. I tried to get more information out of her, but she wouldn't speak. I ran out onto the deck in hopes of catching whatever intruder had been in her treehouse. There was nothing to be found but the rustling leaves in the countryside winds. I helped her down by stabilizing the ladder from the ground below. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky with bright orange and pink streaks. Our walk back to the house was quiet. Madeline kept her focus on her boots as they swept through the snow. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. We made it to the back sliding glass door, and as Madeline reached for the handle, I questioned her once more. "What did you mean someone talked to you?" "I didn't see anybody, and there's no way I missed anyone on the way up." Madeline's hands were still shaking, though I don't think from the cold. She still would not budge. Later that day, Mom had the table set and dinner was ready. Everyone gathered around the table, everyone except for Madeline. "Mom, do you want me to tell Madeline dinner is ready?" "I tried, honey. She's not feeling well." "I'm starting to think we need to get you guys some heavier jackets. Our Kansas immune systems aren't built for the Colorado cold." After dinner, I did the dishes for my mom in exchange for an extra 30 minutes of computer time before bed. As per usual, RuneScape would be the only thing on my agenda for the next hour. As I booted up my old desktop, I couldn't help but think about what had happened earlier. How did Madeline hear somebody if there was no one there? I mean, there's no way anyone else could have been up there. Did she just imagine it? I know that's the logical answer, but the fear that I saw in her eyes forced me to stray away from logic. Anytime my mind started to venture too deep into the game, I was pulled back out of it. I couldn't stop thinking about that damn treehouse. Whatever was happening, it made me upset. Now Madeline would not want to play up there, and I surely did not want to go up alone. It was at that moment my room was lit up with a beam of light emanating from outside. As fast as it appeared, it was gone. Almost like a car's headlights rushing by. There are no public roads for at least half a mile. I jumped from my chair and peered through the window. I could barely make out the snow-covered landscape at night. I flipped the light switch off so that I could see better. Still nothing. I could barely even make out the silhouette of the treehouse in the darkness. Nothing moved. Maybe I just imagined it. At least, I thought I had imagined it, until out of my peripheral I saw that same beam of light in the tree.